I recently got asked, like, what would you consider the quintessential Godzilla movies? To which I asked, well, that depends on the era, because, each era kind of has a different iteration as to what Godzilla is, what Godzilla's meaning is, and an interpretation of the character. But boy howdy did that get me thinking, because I never really had thought about it before. What would the quintessential Godzilla movie be? And how would it be different with every era? And does it necessarily fall into, okay, you have Showa, Heisei, Millennium, Monsterverse, and then finally the Reiwa era? Does it necessarily need to fall into those categories? So I started thinking about it, and lo and behold, here we are. We have a video about that very topic. For the Showa era, I was examining the period and realized that there are essentially three periods within the Showa era Godzilla franchise. There are the 50s, the 60s, and then the 70s. This video by no means is going to be about what I think are the best Godzilla movies from each era, no. Instead, this video is about what are the quintessential Godzilla films that best represent those decades in question. So why would I break down the Showa era into three distinct categories? Well, the 50s Godzilla is certainly different than the 60s Godzilla, and the 60s Godzilla is certainly different than that from the 70s. In the 50s, he was an allegorical destroyer, and quite essentially, basically a manifestation of the nuclear bomb. In the 1960s, he's no longer evil, but instead benevolent, and the plots begin to grow campier and more colorful. And the 1970s embraced the camp and specifically began targeting a younger audience. Each era has a distinct style of writing, cinematography, and overall look, which truly separates them from one another, so that's why I broke the Showa era down in three distinct categories. This is not so much about necessarily the quality of the movie, as much as it is, does it encapsulate what that decade's zeitgeist was, what was popular within the franchise at the time. So these are the three quintessential Godzilla films of the Showa era. So to start off with the 1950s, there's only one possible answer here, and it's the original. Godzilla Raids Again I quite enjoy, especially the Japanese version, but it just doesn't hold a candle to the original Japanese version of Godzilla. The film not only established Godzilla in what almost every other incarnation tries to copy, but it was the movie to make a true cinematic icon, and the longest-running film franchise in the history of the world. This is one of only two Godzilla movies that I can truly sit back and state that it isn't just a good kaiju movie, let alone a good sci-fi film, but just a good movie in general. It's my number 3 favorite film of all time, for God's sakes, and every time I watch it, I notice something new, and I'm still moved by its bleakness, nuanced nature, humanization of our main characters, and the dilemma itself. Because this is a movie that is just as much about what is on screen than is what off it. Knowing Japan's history with the atomic bomb and the Lucky Dragon incident, Ishiro Honda's experiences during the war while in Manchuria, Tanaka flying over Hiroshima, it all truly adds to my enjoyment of the film and provides a lot of context. But all that being said, you don't need to know all of that to understand just how impactful this movie is. Only one other Godzilla movie blatantly goes out of its way to show the terrible human costs a Godzilla attack has. And you watch this movie with Akira Ifukube's haunting score behind it, and feel not just a thought-provoking, tragic experience, but also feel a collective sorrow of an entire nation expressing itself in the form of a giant monster. This is a dead serious movie, one where Ishiro Honda himself threatened to fire anyone working on the movie who did not treat it as such. And it's lightning in a bottle. The definition of lightning in a bottle, a accumulation of men tired of war, all negatively affected by Imperial Japan, then traumatized by being nuked not once, but twice. And how better to personify the atomic bomb than with a giant monster slowly tearing apart your home? The scene where Shinichi watches his brother and mother get trampled by Godzilla, and Shinichi's brother had just survived his ship being destroyed by Godzilla, and he's screaming as the wind is howling, and Ifukube's music is rising, and you hear the thunderous footsteps of Godzilla in the background, all while never seeing Godzilla. That's haunting. That's horrifying. And it's also unbelievably relatable. See, that's because the message is abundantly clear. You cannot escape Godzilla, a physical embodiment of radiation and fallout itself. And while being a black and white movie, in no way is the thematic essence behind the original Godzilla that same black and white. It is not yes or no. Dr. Yamane, the champion for scientific interests and curiosity, is torn between his insatiable appetite to explore, but he also understands just what this monster is capable of. And if he could survive the blast of a hydrogen bomb, what can our contemporary weapons possibly do? Then he watches Godzilla's first attack from atop a hill. People screaming and crying all around him, and he cannot look away. The horror sinking in of what has just risen from the ocean because of other scientists playing God. And then there's one of my favorite human characters of all time, Dr. Serizawa. Now here's a man who genuinely wanted to achieve good for the world, to end hunger, the dream of any young scientist to achieve something great. But instead, he accidentally creates a weapon arguably worse than the hydrogen and atomic bombs. And it's eating him alive, arguably causing him to grow further away from his fiancée Emiko, which is why she falls in love with another man. And yet, she's the only person on Earth he trusts enough to relieve some of his burden and show her the horrors of what he accidentally created. And you can, of course, see where this is going. You know, a man creating the only thing that could possibly kill Godzilla, forced to use his own creation in the hopes no one will use his oxygen destroyer in the future. You know where that's going. And in many ways, he is the ultimate Japanese character. He's tragic and self-sacrificing, an embodiment of so many Japanese people with good intentions, destroyed by their actions in and around the Second World War. And then there's Godzilla, a cold, unfeeling beast with eyes constantly looking down. He does not politely walk through the streets like the creature in The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. This Godzilla is cruel, and specifically targets people, causing as much damage as possible. A true manifestation of anger, radiation, and man's hubris. Yet in the end, as Serizawa's weapon slowly kills Godzilla, you feel for him. Your heart aches for him, because what has he really done when you really look at it? He has been violently mutated and harmed by humanity, and he must be killed for it. And his death scream is truly haunting me. It's basically a moment that no other Godzilla film has ever done or even been close to replicating. It would take a full 40-hour video for me to talk about the pure genius that is the original Godzilla. As I said, it's not just a masterpiece of kaiju cinema, but it's just a masterpiece of cinema in general. And this is, without a doubt, the quintessential Godzilla movie ever made, period, let alone the ones from the 1950s. After all, this is the first, and the first is usually the best, and this film is absolutely no exception. The next two eras are difficult because I find myself torn between two films within each of those eras. However, for the 1960s, I have to buckle down and go with Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. Is it my favorite from this period? No. That's actually the previous movie, Mothra vs. Godzilla, but man, this movie, woof. This was a true turning point for Godzilla as a character. The movie was where he switched from being a force to fear to basically an anti-hero. The beginning of this movie has Godzilla doing what Godzilla does best. He's destroying stuff and fighting another giant monster, in this case Rodan. However, something more terrifying than Godzilla comes from outer space. Ghidorah, a beautiful example of Eiji Tsuburaya and his team's evolution. Ghidorah is elegant, loud, flamboyant. He's basically everything you want from a giant monster. He's got 3 heads that spit lightning, it flies, it looks like a Japanese dragon. What more can you want from a monster than Ghidorah? And this is the first true all-out monster brawl featuring not just Godzilla versus Ghidorah, but throwing Rodan and Mothra on top of it. Throw in a princess who's being hunted by assassins who also thinks she's from the planet Venus and can predict the future, the Shobijin singing and translating what Godzilla, Mothra, and Rodan are saying to each other, and then Mothra brokering a truce between Godzilla and Rodan. Sign me up. It's ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous, but in the best possible way, and the movie must be embraced for it. And that is a true work of art. In fact, I'm going to play a clip from David Callett's amazing audio commentary from Ghidra the Three-Headed Monster that best sums up my thoughts on the movie.
This is a ludicrously silly movie in whatever edition or cut you happen to watch. Enjoy it for that.
This is Toho at its peak. A factory, pumping out 3 kaiju movies in 1964 alone. And yet 2 of the 3 of those movies are total classics in every way, showcasing the true talent and demented imaginations both on and behind the scenes. I'd argue this is also the first movie to truly perfect Shinichi Sekizawa's simple but revolutionary monster formula. Before Sekizawa, monsters created the problem and people solved it. This man brilliantly flipped the trope on its head. People have problems and monsters resolve it. It took several films to perfect this formula, and then this movie comes along. And it was this man, Shinichi Sekizawa, who would bring us some of the craziest, most colorful, and fun movies within the franchise. And I truly think this film, Ghidra the Three-Headed Monster, is Sekizawa's masterpiece. This movie, it's such a good middle ground between the darker Godzilla films from the previous films in the 50s, but also the campiness that we'd see in the later part of the 60s throughout the 70s. It's not too silly, but boy howdy does it not take itself too seriously either.
ねえ、今なんて言ってるのかしら。
おい、無理言うなよ。モンスター語なんて習ったことないよ。
the fucking line gets me every time. It's colorful, it's loud, it's fun. Watch it. You probably already have, considering the fact that you're watching this and you're listening to me talk about it, but if you haven't, just watch it. You're not going to regret it. You're going to have a blast. All right. I can't choose. I can't choose. So, I am going to bring it down to a coin flip. See if I can't. Oh, me. Bring on the hate. Now, this is not what film I think is the best from the era, but what I think best represents said era. And what film has cemented Godzilla more as a pop culture icon than Godzilla vs. Megalon? This movie is why people think Godzilla is nothing but camp and silliness, and I get it. This movie is that to a T. Yet with all of its problems, and yes, it is a bad movie, it nevertheless succeeds in exactly what it wanted to do. This movie was made targeting 5-year-old kids. Kids specifically between 5 and 10 years old. And I know it entertains 5-year-olds because, 1, it entertained me as a 5-year-old, and by the way, this movie still does, and 2, I've seen it entertain other people's 5-year-old kids. And why it is a quintessential representation of 70s era Godzilla is because it's basically accumulations of 70s Toho and pop culture in Japan. We're talking crude, low-budget, stock footage galore, and pure insanity. Pure insanity. Megalon is an absolutely insane design, very similar to what we were seeing over in the kaiju shows being released on TV at the time. And do I really need to say anything about the true star of this movie, Jet Jaguar? Do I really need to say? And I mean, look at that design. How can't you laugh at that? It's so silly. This movie's just silly, and I kind of love it. And yet, despite its low budget and all of its issues, is there really something about this movie that continues to endure to this day? Is it the insanely funky soundtrack by Richiro Manabe? Is it the Godzilla tail slide, the ridiculousness that is Jet Jaguar himself? Why? Why is this movie what people think of when most people imagine Godzilla when you say the name Godzilla in their heads? Well, the answer to that is because it played a lot on TV over here, which is another reason I choose this as a quintessential 70s era Godzilla movie and not the objectively better movies from the era. This movie looks made for TV, in line with a lot of the tokusatsu shows on Japanese television around this period, but it also helps showcase the popularity of Godzilla when it comes to television itself. I came at the tail end of this generation of Godzilla fan, but it wasn't the original Godzilla film that played on TV all the time. It wasn't even the Ishiro Honda movies that played on TV all the time. It was this movie and the other Jun Fukuda movies. Megalon played on TV all the time, cementing Godzilla as a true pop culture icon for good and for bad. It's a stupid movie with a silly plot and lively action full of character that adds huge levels of personality to not just Godzilla, but all three other monsters too. It could have easily just been Godzilla and Megalon, but no. They had to laugh at Godzilla when he gets hurt. Gigan had to direct Megalon's spitting grenades. Godzilla and Jet Jaguar have to shake hands at the end of the day. They have to help each other up. Godzilla has to get in the way of Jet Jaguar to protect him while they're surrounded by fires. It's dumb. It's dumb, it's fun, and it's the quintessential 70s Godzilla flick. This, like all the other Godzilla movies, I could go on for hours talking about the history of the film, the people who made it, and the movie itself. But that's not for this video. So those are the 3 quintessential Showa era Godzilla movies that best represent the decade in which they were made. I know it probably wasn't your favorite one, but again, this wasn't supposed to be what I think are the best of the series. It's what I think best encapsulates the decade in question. What do you think of the most quintessential Showa-era Godzilla films are? Please leave a comment below. And in the end, this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions saying, sayonara. By the way, the coin cost that I had, the film that Godzilla vs. Megalon was up against was Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, 1974. Yeah, please don't kill me.